Hello, welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Hendersonville, North Carolina. Thank you for joining us. I am Ann Talley, your worship associate this week. I miss seeing all of you and look forward to when we can meet again in person. I encourage you to check out our website at uufhnc.org. And please join us on Zoom on Sunday morning at 11:30 for our Stones of Compassion and Beloved Conversations. We call ourselves to worship with UU Minister Erica Hewitt's reflection on Universalism for these times. The chalice, as a symbol of Unitarian Universalism, arose as a beacon of hope in an atmosphere of tyranny. The chalice arose as a sign of promise that the marginalized would neither be forgotten nor ignored because they are beloved and precious from the perspective of the holy. This morning, we remember all of the people who have been told explicitly or implicitly through police violence or government policy, through derision or dehumanization, that they're anything less than whole, anything less than beloved. As we each light a chalice in our homes, may we make of our lives as a beacon, a symbol of our promise to draw the circle wide, a sign that we will not rest until all means all.
Hi everybody, my name is Don Rollins and I proudly serve this congregation in Hendersonville, North Carolina. So glad you could join us today. I'm going to talk about two gifts that are passed down to us from our Universalist forebears. We'll get to that in a minute, but first Mary wants to say hi. Come say hi, Mary.
Hello. I usually don't get to see you.
There we go. Yeah, formalities aside. Before we get into what I have this afternoon, I want us to pause to remember all those who are in dire hardship today, all those affected by the fires out west, all those affected by water in the wrong places in the south, all those who are dealing with the virus in whatever form, in whatever way. We remember those folks. We are connected to those folks. We think of them, we think of their families, we think of their friends, we think of the wildlife. We hold them all close. Call to action, maybe to donate, do what we can to make their lives a little better in the midst of such hardship. So we remember them. I love old small town and rural congregations. I love the smells, I love the wood, I love the character. Moldy, yes. Constant maintenance, true. Technological upgrades versus architectural integrity, always. But that sense of ancestry, that sense of tradition, that sense of belonging, somehow it is in that wood. It's as though the people who built and nurtured the place were whispering to us across the ages, whispering in hushed tones. The late Minnesota poet laureate Bill McKibben beautifully captured this love of old houses of worship in a 2004 story titled High Fidelity, Dogged Devotion. I'm going to share a slightly shortened version, and I want you to listen for the deep presence of something that is beyond ownership of a congregation, something more like trusteeship, something more like vessels for a precious and a healing Universalist message. He writes, I live in the North Country Mountains where winter begins in late October and gives up some years in early May. That means you come to church half the year in boots, heavy boots, in case you get stuck in a snowbank on the way, which means in turn that the carpet on the floor better be some shade of brown. 2 or 3 times in my years there, I have vacuumed the church. The first time I vacuumed, I was merrily buzzing away between the pews, listening to the random click-clack of sand disappearing up the hose, when all of a sudden the noise trebled. Click, click, click like a Geiger counter in a uranium mine. And at that moment, I was vacuuming beneath the third pew right along the center aisle, right where Frank and Jean have been sitting every single Sunday that I can remember. I believe that Frank and Jean began attending our congregation, the Sunday after the Council of Nicaea, and each time they claimed the same familiar spot. I kept vacuuming, hovering over the same steady background of sand, until I reached the sixth pew against the right wall where Velda and Don sit each Sunday. Each Sunday they possibly can, that is, as both of them have been as much in the hospital as out lately. And there again, my Geiger counter went off. I decided that instead of radioactivity, I was measuring something else, fidelity. Spirituality is our watchword at the moment, of course, and rightly so. But Woody Allen had a point when he said that 90% of life consists in just showing up. Consider what it means to belong to the same rural Methodist church for 60 or 70 years. And because Methodist Central Command insists on changing preachers about as frequently as Sheridan changes sheets, and because small, poor rural congregations serve as practice ground for the rawest seminary graduates, anyone sitting in the pews for a decade or two sees a head-spinning mix of styles, theologies, and talents. And when I first arrived, the incumbent pastor was a jailhouse convert, a holy roller with a pinky ring who returned whence he had come after embezzling a widow's insurance. And since then, we've had wonderful people in the pulpit, some conservative, some progressive. Some of them illustrated their sermons with examples taken from some preacher's helper that must have been published in 1921 because all the anecdotes involved World War I. We've taken communion by every method short of scuba diving in a tank of wine. We had one truly great preacher. She was young and smart and funny and full of love, able to talk to young and old, able to afflict the few of us who were comfortable while simultaneously comforting the many afflicted. And she hadn't been there more than a month before we were, all of us, worried sick about what it was going to be like when inevitably she would have to leave. And though none of us would have traded her years for anything, in certain ways it was the hardest passage of all. And through it all, back up here, through it all, Don and Velda and Frank and Jean never wavered. They might not have liked some new theological twist or liturgical gambit, but they didn't complain very much. Not even when every other pastor would reinstitute the greeting of the neighbors or the passing of the peace or whatever they called it. A practice that makes less sense when the same 15 people have already said howdy. And they kept doing the fairly awesome amount of labor, even though a poor small church requires it if it's going to keep going. It's easy to say that all of this doesn't add up to a daring relationship with God. It's still McKibben, by the way. But those of us who've claimed this place were attracted by the sheer dogged determination. And you know, my generation has been good at many things, but tenacity, faithfulness, is not really one of them. We take too much for granted, and we still want more. Marriages that complete us, fulfill us in every way, make us whole, instead of marriages where, on most days, it's enough to be living faithfully together, adding another increment of quotidian devotion, giving each other the benefit of the doubt. But I learned something different from Frank and Jean and Don and Velda. One spring day years ago, when Don and I had finished taking down the storm windows, we decided to climb up into the steeple on a rickety ladder so we could take in a view across our small town. We could see the house where he'd grown up, the graveyard where many generations of his ancestors were buried. And while we were up there, Don showed me something else. The place he had carved his initials and Velda's sometime in the 1920s. Just a second, a computer glitch here. You know, for me, the only sanctuary better than a quiet rural sanctuary is a quiet rural Universalist sanctuary. At least half of my now 30 plus years have been spent in small congregations, 4 of them founded not by Unitarians, but by Universalists. Each is unique, yet like the people who sat in Bill McKibben's Methodist Church, each has a commonality. And my best description is it's a commonality of whispering. It's not a flashy fidelity. It's mellow. There's a Universalist up in Maine who showed me how a liberal Christian church, rescued from fear-based theology, could reclaim Jesus from the fundamentalists. There's the folks in Ohio, aged yet patching weather-beaten windows, weather-beaten clapboards. I still recall one of their flower communions. It was led by 2 teens, 6 children, and an overactive Cocker Spaniel. And then there's the other 2 Ohio congregations, yoked by geography and sharing a minister. The one congregation's church built of quarried stone, featuring a spectacular old pipe organ. The other, an 1847 classic New England wooden structure that in 1963 was transported from foundation to steeple 2 blocks up the street. Nobody seemed to know why, but it really did happen. Friends, these are amazing communities. These are amazing ambassadors for a faith both alive and sorely needed in this age of runaway sectarianism. So what comes next is the separation between universalism, that warm, fuzzy theological relic that some people suppose, to separate that from the living, if quiet, inheritance that is yours and mine. What comes next is a 2-part primer in why yesterday's universalism is today's profile in spiritual courage. Let's start with the central tenet that connects those musty but sacred congregations I've served. I would call that simply love in spite of it all. Like most of the Christian traditions that came of age starting with the Reformation, Universalism began as an idea, a 3rd century reading of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures in direct conflict with the Orthodox doctrine of eternal punishment. Less scholarly than the Unitarians, the radical idea of universal salvation relied on a very different relationship with the holy. Here, we're loving not because we're going to get in trouble with God if we don't, but because we're in love with God, a God who will not abandon us no matter what. To borrow from Christian scriptures, 1 John chapter 4, there is a verse here that I've heard in so many Universalist congregations. So simple, so straight ahead. Maybe you know it. God is love. No compromises, no exceptions. In universalism, God is love. But this bone-deep belief is not that easy, sweeping, greeting card love. It's the messy, the daunting, give and take with one another and the world who needs that love. That's the kind of love the Universalists taught. Now, most of the early and middle Universalists still held to the doctrines of original sin and the deity of Jesus. But as was stated by Universalist leaders in the Winchester Profession of 1803, their landmark statement of beliefs, true religion is more about believers than beliefs. I quote, "We believe that holiness and true happiness are inseparably connected, and that the believers ought to be careful to maintain order and practice good works, for these good things are profitable unto men." Sexist language noted, cringeworthy to our modern ears. But this final paragraph of the profession ends with the resounding 2-fold message: being holy, and that is behaving in accord with our shared values, and being happy, safe from the hounds of hell, are not only possible, but that's the religion God intended. So what's the Universalist good news for this day? That love is a clumsy covenant with life, God, to be a little bit better today than yesterday. That's it. Not because living alone will save us, but because we don't want to leave any love on the table when it's our time to check out. That's the simplicity of universalism. The Universalist good news across the century is we're free to love for love's sake. So as retired Episcopal Bishop John Spong counsels us, we're supposed to love wastefully. There's a second lesson I'd bring to you from our Universalist tribal elders. That one is likewise simple. Practicality in all matters. You know, it's telling that so many of the UU champions we've memorized were male and Unitarian. This is partly because of sexist oppression, partly to Unitarianism's much higher profile in literary, academic, social, and urban circles. But while the Universalist presence was and remains muted in our fuller story, imagine this movement without the likes of Clara Barton, Augusta Jane Chapin, Olympia Brown, Judith Sargent Murray, George de Benneville, John Murray. This lack of star power is testimony to how different the two denominations were as they approached merger nearly 60 years ago. The intense individualism and intellectualism baked into Unitarian thought and practice was in step with the colonies all the way through the Civil War. And it gave Americans a who's who of influential personalities. But meanwhile, the Universalists here and in Canada were largely rural and working class. Recall their organizing principle was not a fully human Jesus, nor the inherent goodness of humanity, but an eternal love affair with their Maker. Some notable exceptions notwithstanding, Benjamin Rush, for example, Rush, who was a signer of the Declaration. But while Unitarian leaders were busy helping to shape the nation, Universalist leaders were more likely to be found working and serving and spreading the faith with the help of, yes, circuit-riding preachers. And while Unitarians were infiltrating Harvard, training ministers to exegete scripture and preach the issues of the day, upstart Universalist preacher Hosea Ballou was plucked off the platform during a typically emotional Universalist service and ordained to ministry on the spot. According to the late premier scholar of Universalism in America, Ernie Cassara, young Ballou barely knew what had hit him. I'm all about Universalist practicality. And again, I have lost my place. I'll get right back with you. I'm all about Universalist practicality, but let's be honest. While Universalists were a nuts and bolts lot at the local level, that practicality did not always extend to their denominational organizing. They were far better at starting than maintaining institutions. Tufts University comes to mind, and their beloved tradition was a mere shadow of itself by the time of merger. But once again, allowing for notable exceptions, it just wasn't in the Universalist DNA to perpetuate a strong central presence. It was to live and then spread a gospel in stark contrast to that of the Calvinists. It was the uncomplicated but life-altering gospel of Universalist salvation. So listen to the whispers, folks. What are they telling us? They're telling us to love, telling us to be practical. telling us to measure our faith not in public shouts, but in whispers. Whispers like, are we there for one another despite our great differences? When was the last time we shared a good belly laugh? Are we a people willing, no, eager, to forsake our intellectual comfort zones, to simply get out there and bind up the broken and the bleeding who need our compassion? Now let's keep this real. Man, Universalists could and can be theologically arrogant. They've got God's truth. They can be communally insular. We've got God's truth. But their humanity does not diminish their worth in a world starved for positive religion, their day and ours. So look here, if the equally human Unitarians across time are still calling us to greater heights and deeper awareness, then surely those Universalists are whispering at bedtime, but were you a better person today than yesterday? I want to end by saying what's pretty obvious by now. Those 4 Universalist congregations I mentioned earlier, Bill McKibben's Own to North Country Faithful, my ruminations about Universalist love and practicality, I believe deeply that Universalism is still a sustaining force, a compass in the shadowy world of viruses and floods and fires, and a nation battered by political neglect and abuse in high places. But how fortunate are we? On our toughest days, how fortunate are we? For we are gifted with what the book of Hebrews calls a cloud of witnesses, and an unobtrusive, but always at the ready congregation of those who have tread this same Universalist path, endured the same Universalist hardship, and emerged with their Universalist souls still intact. So let's pause. Let's bless them. Recommit ourselves to their gentle gospel, for it's still alive, and we are the bearers. So be these things.
Good morning. I'm Jan Parton, member of the Social Justice and Outreach Team, or SJOT. As Charlotte mentioned last week, SJOT is hosting our first ever virtual outreach collection. It will be in support of the Creation Care Alliance of Western North Carolina, or the CCA. Last February, we voted to make environmental justice our focus. Creation Care Alliance promotes the ideals embedded in environmental justice and is committed to carrying out related projects. In case you're not familiar with CCA, they're a network of congregations who have united around a moral and spiritual call to preserve the integrity, the beauty, and the health of the earth, and work to ensure the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income. With respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies, they bring a practical and hopeful solutions to congregations in Western North Carolina, and engage hearts and minds through education, service, and advocacy. With limited resources but lots of passion, CCA of Western North Carolina has been able to accomplish some really amazing things in the past 3 years. A climate and faith forum, clergy breakfasts, public education events, and many advocacy initiatives, just to name a few. UUFH entered into a covenant partnership with them several years ago. And as a covenant partner, we committed, along with CCA, to being faithful stewards and agreed to benefit from the resources and the network of the CCA. And you can learn more about them by going to their website at creationcarealliance.org. And you can donate by going to our website, uufhnc.org, and clicking on Donate and specifying Outreach Fund, or by sending a check to UUFH and specifying CCA collection in the memo line. Creation Care Alliance really needs our support, so thank you in advance for your very generous gift.
We bring today's service to a close with this invitation to be faithful Universalists, grateful for our blessings, eager to share them with a broken world. Gathered in our varied faiths, we give thanks for the blessings of world community as we share our common dream. Homes and schools where children thrive, neighborhoods that are safe and clean, a city rich in colors and cultures, an economy where no one is expendable, a beloved community where rich and poor alike have access to the opportunity for a dignified and productive life, churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples where our deepest hope is to be of service to a hurting world. Enable us as we leave this place to carry forth this prayer into the coming week, turning our thoughts toward charity, our hearts toward justice, and our hands toward the work of peace. Shalom and amen.
Folks, thanks for joining us. As always, I know that there are lots of places you could be online today, but you've been here with us. We appreciate it. Just a little bit of housekeeping here at the end. If you're going to be joining us for the live 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time sharing on Sunday, here's the questions to ponder ahead of time. The first is, do you connect with the Universalist side or a blended UU family? And I'm going to trust that in some way that's true for you. And if so, then think about how and why. What is there in that old message that still speaks to and for you? And then second question, what does modern universalism have to offer today's Unitarian Universalism? In other words, what do love and simplicity have to do with our neighbors and our world and our denomination? Give that some thought too. Thanks again. Hope to see you on Sunday around 11:30 a.m. Eastern.